December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns and the Pacific becomes an ocean of chaos. Within days, the United States faces a nightmare no bomb or bullet could cause. Across distant islands, American soldiers shiver beneath collapsing tents, drenched, sick, and sleepless. Ammunition rots in the rain, supplies sink in mud. The greatest military machine on earth is crumbling from weather, not war. But from this desperation will rise a strange steel miracle, an invention so simple, so unstoppable, it will help win the Pacific. In the first chaotic weeks after Pearl Harbor, American commanders discover a problem no one had prepared for. It isn't the Japanese Navy. It isn't aircraft shortages. It's the rain. From the Philippines to Wake Island, tens of thousands of men live under canvas tents that dissolve under tropical downpours. Within 3 weeks, fabric turns to pulp, poles rot, and entire camps collapse into the mud. Medical reports describe soldiers hospitalized with pneumonia, not from combat, but from sleeping in puddles that used to be their beds. Ammunition soaks through, food spoils, and supply depots vanish beneath rivers of water and mold. The War Department's morning briefings grow darker with every field report. Wooden barracks would solve it, but there's no lumber on coral atolls, no carpenters, and no time. The Navy estimates it would take 18 months to build enough permanent housing. The war in the Pacific will be lost long before that. In Washington, Brigadier General Eugene Raybould stares at a crisis table covered in weather maps and deployment charts. The math is brutal. 2 million men need shelter across 1,000 islands. The options, canvas or wood, are both failures. They need something else. Something light, fast, and indestructible. A building that can be made in Pennsylvania, shipped through submarine-infested waters, assembled by exhausted Marines with no tools or training, and survive a typhoon. It sounds impossible, but desperate wars have a way of forcing impossible things to exist. The War Department sends out a call that sounds like a fantasy. Design a building that weighs less than a jeep, can be packed on a single rail car built in one day by untrained men, costs under $1,000, and survives. 130-degree heat, monsoon rains, and Japanese bombs. It's February 1942. The United States is still reeling from defeat after defeat. But in a quiet corner of Rhode Island, a group of engineers prepares to do the impossible. Their inspiration comes from an unlikely source, Britain's North African campaign. Since World War I, the British Army had used Nissen huts, corrugated steel half-circles that could be bolted together to form instant barracks. They survived sandstorms, extreme heat, and could be assembled without skilled labor. But the Nissen design was far from perfect. It was heavy, required concrete foundations, and turned into a furnace in humid air. For the jungles of the Pacific, it was useless. At the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, Commander John Philip Drosfeld studies the British blueprints and sees both brilliance and disaster. The arch shape deflects wind and sheds rain beautifully, but everything else would fail in tropical conditions. Termites would devour the wooden supports, and steel bolts would rust into dust within months. He marks the ventilation system in red ink, unacceptable for Pacific use. Meanwhile, a name from outside the military world begins to echo through engineering circles: Buckminster Fuller. The eccentric architect had been preaching the future of prefabricated housing for decades, claiming that homes should be mass-produced like cars. Factories, not construction sites, should build the future. Most dismissed him as a dreamer, but in wartime America, his ideas suddenly feel like prophecy. The Navy takes notice. They establish a design team at a newly commissioned base on Narragansett Bay, Quonset Point, Rhode Island. The task: reinvent the Nissen hut for the modern war. The men assembled there are not ordinary builders. They are steel manufacturers, industrial designers, and field engineers who have seen typhoons firsthand. Otto Brandenberger, a farm structure specialist from Strand Steel Corporation, brings an idea so radical it borders on heresy. Get rid of the wooden skeleton entirely. Make the corrugated steel shell carry the entire load. Traditional architecture says that's impossible. But Brandenburger's farm silos and barns had already survived tornadoes in the Midwest, using the same self-supporting arch. If it can survive a Kansas twister, it can survive the Pacific. The British, still fighting in Burma and Singapore, send over their failure reports. Pages of grim data about what tropical weather does to buildings: paint eaten by fungus, wood devoured by insects, metal joints turned to powder by salt air. Each failure becomes a lesson. By April 1942, the concept takes shape, a fusion of the British Nissan's geometry, Fuller's prefabrication philosophy, and American industrial muscle. At Quonset Point, 30 engineers work around the clock in a converted warehouse. They sleep on cots beside their drafting tables, fueled by black coffee and urgency. There's no time for blueprints. They build and test in real time. Sketch by morning, prototype by evening, revision by dawn. The floor becomes a battlefield of failed ideas, twisted panels, cracked bolts, melted joints. Each failure brings them closer to something that works. Every detail becomes a war of inches. The structure must fit on a rail car, 16 feet wide, 20 feet long. It must be strong enough to stand against 100 mph winds, yet light enough for 4 men to lift. For 2 weeks, the team argues over the curve of the arch. Too flat and the wind will tear it apart. Too steep and there's no interior space. Finally, they settle on perfection. An 8-foot radius, forming a perfect semicircle. It's beautiful, efficient, brutal. The first prototype rises in May 1942. 6 sailors, armed with wrenches and a half-page of instructions, assemble it in 14 hours. It works, but not fast enough. The Navy demands 1-day construction, no exceptions. Then comes Brandenburger's breakthrough. Eliminate the floor entirely. Let the hut sit directly on the earth, coral, or sand. Suddenly, assembly time drops to 8 hours. The total weight falls by 200 pounds. A miracle in metal is born. It's not yet named. But soon the world will know it as the Quonset Hut, a structure that will shelter millions, survive the world's worst storms, and outlast the war itself. The first prototype stands gleaming under the grey Rhode Island sky, an arch of corrugated steel curving from earth to earth like a metallic rainbow. It looks absurdly simple, but simplicity is deceptive. Inside the Quonset Point warehouse, every inch of that curve has been fought for with sleepless nights, mathematical chaos, and relentless field testing. Every panel, every bolt, every hole placement is the product of war-level precision. The engineers have one rule: if a single soldier in the Pacific can't build it blindfolded, it's a failure. They strip the design down until nothing remains but raw purpose. No ornament, no excess, just function. Each cut consists of prefabricated ribs, rolled sheets of galvanized steel, corrugated to increase strength without adding weight. The ribs lock into one another like armor scales, forming a perfect semicircle 8 feet high and 16 feet wide, extendable in 4-foot segments to any length. The ends are closed with simple plywood walls, cut with circular windows for ventilation. The floor is optional: gravel, coral, or dirt, depending on the island. Every part fits within a single wooden crate. 6 crates make a hut. 1 truck, 1 crane, 12 men, and 8 hours, that's all it takes. For the Pacific campaign, this is revolution. But design isn't the only challenge. Production must scale to numbers no one has ever attempted before. The Navy demands 30,000 units within a year, and not just huts. Variations for hospitals, warehouses, kitchens, machine shops, and even chapels. In the age of battleships and bombers, it's easy to forget that wars are won by logistics. A soldier without shelter fights half as well, eats less, sleeps worse, and dies sooner. The Quonset Hut becomes the invisible weapon, the one that doesn't fire but keeps those who do alive. Factories across America are converted overnight. The George A. Fuller Company and Strand Steel of Michigan become the war's new arsenal of architecture. Sheet metal pours from mills in Chicago. Pittsburgh and Detroit trucked east to Rhode Island, where teams of women and civilian workers pack the kits under tight military secrecy. Each crate carries a stamped label, Quonset Hut, Naval Standard Model. In just 6 months, 25,000 huts are on ships bound for the Pacific, but before they can be trusted in battle, they must be tested against the elements that destroyed every design before them. Summer 1942. A hurricane slams into Narragansett Bay. Winds exceed 90 miles per hour. Waves rip through the shore. At Quonset Point, engineers rush into the storm to see whether their creation will hold. The next morning, the coastline is wrecked. Hangars are shredded. Wooden buildings lie scattered like matchsticks. But the steel huts remain, bent, scarred, but standing. It's proof of concept delivered by nature herself. By fall, the Navy begins shipping Quonset kits to every front. Guadalcanal, Midway, Samoa, and beyond. Each island tells the same story. In the fated jungles of the Solomons, Seabees unload the crates, still hot from the tropical sun. The instructions are barely a page long. No words, just diagrams. Within hours, the arch rises, then another, and another. Within a single day, a jungle clearing becomes a functioning base. Barracks, kitchens, hospitals, storage units, and radar posts, all identical, all indestructible. The Quonset Hut becomes the beating heart of America's Pacific network, a modular city of steel that can appear anywhere. Anytime. It doesn't just change logistics, it changes morale. Soldiers who had been sleeping under leaking tents now rest inside cool, dry structures. Doctors finally have sterile-covered spaces to perform surgeries. Mechanics can repair aircraft engines out of the rain. A new phrase enters the language of the Seabees. If you can't build it, you're not trying. In just 1 year, over 120,000 Quonset huts are produced. By 1945, that number will exceed 150,000. Enough steel shelters to circle the earth, and with every shipment, their design evolves. The early Model B, with its full semicircular arch, is followed by the Quonset T, wider and taller for hospital and mess use. Then the Quonset redesign, flat-ended, modular, more efficient for stacking and transport. No two fronts use them the same way. On Okinawa, Marines stack sandbags along the sides for extra blast protection. In New Guinea, huts are raised on stilts to fight off flooding. In the Aleutians, they're lined with insulation and stoves, glowing like lanterns against the Arctic dark. They become homes, hospitals, workshops, and temples. Chaplains hang makeshift crosses on plywood walls. Medics hang IV bags from the steel ribs. Engineers mount radio arrays on their roofs. Commanders draw invasion maps across their curved interiors. They become the war's quiet witnesses, present at every campaign, every turning point. When soldiers return from the front, they often say they lived inside a tin can, but to many, the tin can meant survival. For the men of the Pacific, the Quonset Hut wasn't just a structure, it was civilization. The war ends not with silence, but with a strange metallic echo, the sound of thousands of Quonset huts still standing long after the guns have gone quiet. In 1945, as Japan surrenders and the Pacific falls into uneasy peace, the United States Army looks around and realizes something remarkable. The huts are everywhere. From the beaches of Tarawa to the ice fields of Attu, from the jungles of the Philippines to the docks of Pearl Harbor, the arching silhouettes of corrugated steel gleam under every horizon. They've survived everything. Cyclones, artillery fire, even earthquakes. When B-29s returned from firebombing raids over Tokyo, they landed beside Quonset control towers. When GIs celebrated VJ Day on distant islands, they did it under Quonset roofs. But the war that gave birth to them is over. And now the world is drowning in the aftermath. Millions of troops must be housed, demobilized, or sent home. Europe lies in ruins, its cities flattened, its people homeless. The Pacific Islands are littered with equipment, materials, and steel huts that no one knows what to do with. To the War Department, they're surplus. To the rest of the world, they're salvation. By 1946, Quonset huts begin to take on a second life, one no general ever planned for. Shipments of surplus huts flood ports from San Francisco to Manila. Civilian contractors buy them by the hundreds for pennies on the dollar. Whole towns spring up from leftover war materials. In Guam and Saipan, returning locals rebuild their homes from the same steel that once housed American soldiers. In Japan, the U.S. occupation authorities erect Quonset bases across Yokohama, Tokyo, and Okinawa, miniature cities of arched metal that hum with post-war activity. In Europe, they become the backbone of recovery. The U.S. Army's occupation zones in Germany, Austria, and Italy need instant infrastructure, supply depots, hospitals, and administration offices. Instead of constructing new buildings, they simply ship in crates of Quonset huts. Within weeks, American bases rise from the ashes of destroyed cities. But something else happens, something almost poetic. Civilians begin buying them too. In the bombed-out suburbs of Britain, France, and the Netherlands, desperate families buy surplus huts and turn them into homes. Photographs from 1947 show children playing outside corrugated steel homes painted white, smoke rising from improvised chimneys. In Italy, Quonset huts become schools. In Greece, they become churches. Even the United Nations uses them, temporary field offices during the founding years of global diplomacy. For many across the shattered world, the Quonset hut becomes a symbol not of war but of recovery. It's not beautiful. It's not comfortable. But it's standing, and that's more than most buildings can say. Back in America, the huts take on an entirely new identity. After the war, millions of servicemen return home to a country unprepared to house them. Colleges overflow with students on the new GI Bill. Construction materials are scarce. And once again, the humble Quonset hut answers the call. Across hundreds of campuses, Harvard, Michigan, Stanford, UCLA, steel huts appear almost overnight. Classrooms, dormitories, cafeterias, entire Quonset villages house the tidal wave of veterans starting new lives. At the University of Minnesota, students nickname their temporary homes Tin Town. At Stanford, they call it Veterans Village. These curved metal homes become a defining feature of post-war America. Crude, cheap, and full of life. For many families, it's the first roof they ever owned. By the 1950s, Quonset-style architecture explodes into civilian life. Surplus kits are sold through catalogs. Farmers buy them for barns. Mechanics use them as workshops. They become diners, churches, grocery stores, even movie theaters. One California town boasts a Quonset bowling alley. In Alaska, they become survival shelters. In the Midwest, tornado-resistant barns. In the Deep South, hurricane refuges. From a desperate wartime necessity, the Quonset hut quietly evolves into one of the most enduring architectural exports in American history. But not everyone celebrates them. Architects of the post-war world, men like Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier, see them as crude, temporary, even ugly. They represent function without form, necessity without art. Magazines deride them as the slums of tomorrow, and yet they endure, because unlike the polished visions of architectural theory, the Quonset hut doesn't need approval. It simply works. It survives where others fail. It stands where others crumble. By the time the Korean War erupts in 1950, the Quonset returns to duty, now refined, expanded, and mass-produced again. This time the huts aren't just shelters, but command centers, radar stations, and mobile hospitals. Soldiers who grew up inside them during World War II find themselves returning to their steel childhood homes. A strange nostalgia takes root. For all its harshness, the heat, the noise, the echoing walls, there's something familiar, even comforting, about the curved steel shell, and that nostalgia spreads far beyond the military. In the decades that follow, The Quonset Hut becomes part of the cultural landscape. It appears in films, photographs, and even songs, a relic of both war and survival. In small towns across America, their silhouettes still rise at the edge of fields, faded but unbroken. Historians estimate that by the 1970s, over 500,000 Quonset-style structures still stand worldwide. Some are abandoned, others repurposed into workshops, museums, and homes, and yet their story doesn't truly end. In the modern world, where climate disasters, wars, and refugee crises displace millions, architects and aid organizations once again turn to the same principles that built the Quonset Hut: simplicity, modularity, strength. Companies in Japan, Canada, and the United States still manufacture steel arch buildings based on the 1942 design. They're used for disaster relief, military bases, and even high-tech research stations in Antarctica. 80 years later, the DNA of the Quonset Hut continues to live on in every prefab shelter, every curved steel warehouse, every instant home designed for a world in chaos. And yet, the most haunting legacy isn't steel or numbers. It's memory. Veterans who fought in the Pacific remember the sound of rain on those corrugated roofs, the metallic drumming that meant safety after chaos. Nurses remember the smell of antiseptic in Quonset field hospitals. Pilots remember briefings before dawn inside curved metal walls covered with maps of the Pacific. Those huts, born from desperation, became silent witnesses to the greatest conflict in human history and to everything that followed. The war made them necessary. Humanity made them eternal. It began as desperation, a problem no one could solve. How to give millions of men a roof, when there was no wood, no time, and no second chances. And yet from that urgency, from the chaos of 1942, came a shape so simple it could be drawn by a child, a curve of steel against the horizon. The Quonset Hut was never meant to be beautiful. It wasn't designed for comfort or elegance or permanence, but it outlasted the war that created it. And in doing so, it became something greater than architecture. It became memory made solid. For the soldiers who lived beneath its echoing ribs, the sound of rain on metal meant life. For doctors and nurses, it meant a dry space to heal the wounded. For mechanics, it meant shelter to fix the planes that kept the Pacific alive. And for millions of displaced people after the war, that same arch of steel meant a home, a church, a school, a beginning. Somewhere in the world today, one still stands. Rusted, dented, but standing. The paint is long gone. The plywood has rotted away, but if you step inside, you can still hear the faint echo of what it once was. The voices, the engines, the storms that passed above it. It doesn't belong to any one country. It belongs to the idea that human beings, when pressed to the edge, will always find a way to build. From the coral beaches of Guadalcanal to the frozen winds of the Aleutians, the Quonset Hut stood not as a fortress, but as proof that survival doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears rust. The next time you drive past one, curved, corrugated, forgotten, remember what it represents. A world on fire, a generation that refused to collapse, and the miracle of steel that kept them standing. Because history isn't just written in victories or defeats. Sometimes it's written in the shadows of things that endure, in a simple arc of metal born of war that refused to die.